Hello, my name is Joseph Williams. I'm an assistant professor of counseling and development at George Mason University. One of my research interests is looking at multicultural social justice training, not only of counselors, but of helping professionals. I'm excited to be here with you today, talking a little bit about stereotypes and overcoming stereotypes, and particularly if we're talking about law enforcement. A few objectives before we actually jump into the presentation for today, which will be a two-part module, just to kind of go over those so that you know where we're going with this presentation. One of the things that I'm hoping to do, or hoping that we'll get out of it, is to be able to increase our understanding of implicit and explicit stereotypes, how those stereotypes not only develop, but how they actually survive over time. What are some of the negative effects of those stereotypes, specifically within the context of law enforcement? And then part two of our series kind of jumps into what are some evidence-based strategies that we can use on a more personal level to kind of overcome some of those implicit biases and stereotypes that we hold. Before we really start to understand what stereotypes are, I think it's important that we distinguish between stereotypes, prejudice, and discrimination. So I'm just going to list off a couple of definitions here. When we're talking about prejudice, we're talking about negative learned attitudes towards a group of people. Discrimination is negative behaviors directed towards a specific group of people. And then our topic today, which is stereotypes, which are a general belief about a group of people. And so how stereotypes differ from prejudice is that it can have positive or negative connotations. So for example, a negative stereotype could be that individuals from impoverished backgrounds tend to be more involved in criminal activities. Negative connotation. Positive connotation could be Asian Americans are very cooperative, very compliant when being stopped or being questioned. So again, there's a negative or positive connotation that can actually come from stereotypes. When left unchecked, stereotypes actually run the risk of becoming prejudicial and leading to discriminatory behavior. And so that's a little bit about what we're going to talk about today, stereotypes, which isn't unique to law enforcement officers, but is actually a human condition, but when left unchecked can actually have some really negative consequences. Okay, so when we're looking at science about what stereotypes are, we're basically talking about cognitive shortcuts. Right, so when we look at social science or social psychology, we know that at any given point of time, the human brain is actually exposed to 11 million bits of information. However, we only have the capacity to actually process 40 pieces of information at a time. And so stereotypes become a cognitive shortcut, a way of actually processing information so that we're able to react and to make decisions in the moment. Some of the benefits of stereotypes is that it actually helps us to actually explain social situations. It justifies our actions, our behaviors, even our beliefs. It helps us to differentiate between groups, as well as inform impressions quickly so that we can act quickly. And we actually use our past experience to kind of guide new interactions. And I really want to emphasize when we're talking about these cognitive shortcuts, especially within the context of law enforcement, that these are really, really, really important things, because for some, these cognitive shortcuts could actually be the results, or they could actually help determine life and death for a police officer or their partner. So it's really important that we talk about stereotypes in a way in which I'm not condemning stereotypes, but I'm actually normalizing them as actually a very human process that we're going to try to actually put some type of controlled processing around so that we can actually understand them and understand when we're actually operating from stereotypes. A couple other points really quickly. Stereotypes do not have to be actually spoken. They can also be unspoken in our behavior and our interactions with others. For example, if I'm to approach a vehicle with my hand on my gun, as a sign of conscience, I can actually be interpreting or actually expressing a stereotype I have about that individual who's in the car, especially if that's not a standard practice I use with every routine traffic stop. So just a quick example of spoken versus nonverbal forms of stereotypes. And so when we're talking about stereotypes, there are two forms. So we can actually take that category and actually condense it into implicit versus explicit. So when we're talking about explicit stereotypes, those are the ones that we deliberately think about, that we're very conscious and we're very actually aware of those stereotypes. The implicit stereotypes, which we're talking about today, are ones that actually occur outside of the control or outside of our consciousness or that control. So again, we don't even have to agree with certain stereotypes in order to actually operate from them, because stereotypes become somewhat of an automatic processing. Uh, the environment plays a role in how we develop it. We'll talk about that a little bit later. However, again, we mentioned this slide before, the good news is that we can actually control some of the automatic processing of stereotypes, and we'll get that information in Module 2. Okay. So what I wanted to talk about a little bit about is where stereotypes come from. So we know that stereotypes aren't just an individual thing, but they actually come from our environment as well. And so culture, so how society, whether it's mass media or what have you, depicts it or has certain associations, actually creates stereotypes. So if African Americans or blacks have been historically depicted as criminals or more likely to be involved in substance abuse and things of that nature, those associations actually start to lead to stereotypes which become unconscious processes for us. There's a social learning theory about where stereotypes come from, that we learn them. We learn them from our families, we learn them from schools, our religious institutions, society, things of that nature. So these are very learned types of thought processes. Cognitive sources, which we talked about a little bit before as far as information process, that the tendency for human beings to categorize information so that we can actually process and we can make the best decision possible. Other theories about where stereotypes actually come from. In-group favoritism, the reality is that we tend to have more bias towards others who are not like us. So we tend to favor those who look like us, those who share similar beliefs and values, whether this is thoughts, attitudes, or if we're talking about race or sexual orientation or ability versus disability. Again, those who look like us, we tend to actually hold more favored. Attribution bias is another theory that talks about where stereotypes actually come from. Attribution bias is a human error when we actually tend to contribute or attribute negative behaviors to a person's disposition versus looking at situational factors. So again, attribution bias, we tend to actually over-attribute a person's disposition or their personality or characteristics to their negative behavior, and we kind of underestimate situational forces or factors that may actually contribute to the behavior that we're seeing. The last theory is moods and emotions. And so one of the things that we look at is emotions. So we know that when people are actually in a bad mood, they tend to actually pay too much attention to detail, and they're more likely to actually act out of stereotypical assumptions. And so mood and emotions and mental health is a large part of our ability to kind of control our actions or our reactions to individuals. A couple more slides. One, how do stereotypes actually survive? So we know a little bit about stereotypes and we know where they come from, but how do they actually survive? And those are a few slides that I want to talk about as we wrap up. One is a color blindness approach, and it doesn't have to be color blindness. I can actually put any demographic variable or statistic up there. So the belief that I treat everyone equally, or I see everyone equally, or I have no biases is really uncovering, looking at suppression. So it's suppressing the idea that we have biases and that we have stereotypes. And research shows that those who actually suppress those very human tendencies tend to operate from them more often. There's subtyping. Another way of looking at that is looking at exceptions. So we look at a group of individuals and we say that, all individuals start to actually behave in a certain way. However, there are a few exceptions, but that the majority actually, they're the criminals or things of that nature. So we look at exceptionalism or subtyping when we're talking about those types of behaviors. Confirmation bias, we tend to actually look for information that confirms the biases that we have. We talked about dispositional attributions and the culture and motivations and things of that nature. Negative effects of stereotypes, which is our last slide before we cut for part one, is looking at the influences of our perceptions of others. So our stereotypes influence how we perceive others and how we actually react to others, as well as it affects their behavior. So we can talk about stereotype threat. So if I approach someone in a stereotypical manner, they may actually react in a way that actually fulfills the stereotype in which I'm actually portraying on them. So there becomes this perpetuating cycle of behaviors and interactions that create and lead to actual mistrust, as well as we see victim effects where we start to blame victims, we start to rationalize our behaviors, as well as shooter bias, which there's a lot of research that shows that negative associations impede police decision making, in which we see evidence and examples such as the Tamir Rice, where mistakes as it relates to our expectations of who's considered dangerous, who's considered a threat, or are actually false, or they're actually incorrect, and more often than not. And so there's really powerful and really harmful impacts or effects of stereotypes if they're actually left unchecked, right? And so that's what part one of this activity is actually about. And what we're going to see in part two is what can you actually do about that. And so before I conclude, our very last slide is looking at some of the historical research or information that we see out as it relates to who's more likely to be imprisoned, who's more likely to be stopped and arrested, those who are actually more likely to, those groups, more likely to report police brutality and certain things of that nature, all can be attributed to a certain degree, the certain stereotypes that we actually hold. And so that concludes part one of our series about overcoming stereotypes. Please stay tuned for part two when we actually talk about tangible strategies we can actually use to overcome those stereotypes that we talked about in part one. So thank you.